Hello and welcome to Differential Discussions. I'm Melissa,
And I'm Dave.
and today we're going to talk about red cell morphology. We're going to talk about megaloblastic anemias.
hmm hmm Yeah, so megaloblastic.
What?
Mega. So the general picture here is big red cells, macrocytes, right? And I don't know how much we want to go into patho.
I think we could do similar, just the basics.
Yeah, okay. So megaloblastic anemia develops from a deficiency in either folate or B12. And on your own, you can kind of go and look at the metabolic processes kind of involved there. But essentially, we have problems with DNA synthesis. And so leading from the problems in DNA synthesis, we have red cells that don't divide as often as a consequence. And so they stay rather large relative to a normal red cell. And then we also have a phenomenon with the granulocytes. And so we have a nice neutrophil here in the picture displaying hypersegmentation. So neutrophils will have, what is it,
3 to
5 to 7?
3 to 5.
Well, yeah, 3 to 5 normally, right?
Yes.
And then with hypersegmentation, we're talking about greater than 5
Right.
segments. And so this one's a good example of that.
Yeah. So this one's got a bunch. So it's got one here, right?
Mhm.
One here. Here. This little one there. There's another one here. It looks like we have one here, and this is either 1 or 2. It's kind of hard to see if this is 1 or 2, but it doesn't matter. We're already greater than 5, so.
Right, yeah. So this one's got oodles of lobes.
Yeah, so he is hypersegmented.
So really neat. And typically, you want to see several of these. I think we kind of tell our students somewhere around 5 or so.
Yeah, and I think that the number that you see will depend on the institution. So how many you're actually going to call. Yeah, in general, when we are teaching, we use about 5. If you see 5, then the hypersegmentation is present, because hypersegs are not counted separately from neutrophils. They're still neutrophils. They have the same function. They just have a hypersegmented nucleus.
Yeah, so just qualitatively to make the distinction and call it, because I suppose it's possible you could come across one hyperseg, right? And we don't want to be overly sensitive to calling something when there's not like a true megaloblastic anemia present. But yeah, hypersegs, they're cool.
Yeah. And really the only exciting thing you're going to see is macrocytes. Macrocytic red cells, and sometimes they're ovalocytes. So you can have macroovalos, macrocytes, ovalocytes.
Mhm.
Yeah, and so if you're looking around here, you're thinking like this one's this one's almost more of an ellipto over here with those nice parallel edges. But you have
It's a
these cells that
huge ellipto.
are large, so they're macrocytic, and then they're ovoid in shape. So you have a macrocytic ovalocyte. So that's the characteristic morphological feature that we're really going to see on the peripheral blood smear for our megaloblastic anemias. Occasionally you'll see other things, maybe some basophilic stippling, maybe a few other morphological features, but for the most part, you're going to see macroovalocytes.
And it's funny, the macrocytes here are so big that neutrophil looks tiny, doesn't it?
I know, it's great. It really is, because these red cells are huge. It almost makes, like, when you look, you're like, oh my gosh, like this looks tiny, this looks tiny, but those are probably normocytic red cells.
So, yeah, and we kind of talked about this in our iron deficiency video, where you get this little bit of disorientation where you're comparing things within the fields. So,
all right, so let's move a field, and let's see what else we can. So I think it's important just to say that not every neutrophil is going to be hypersegmented.
We sort of cherry picked that first one to start. Yeah.
We did. We went and found a nice hyperseg. We didn't have to look very hard though. It came pretty quickly. So again, we have our neutrophil. He's not hypersegmented. He's just regular. And then we have macrovalocytes. So we've got a couple of neutrophils here. Whoops, a little bit too far. Let me get you back. Oh no, there's only one now. Okay, I'm just gonna stay here. So this guy here, I mean, he still only has 5 lobes, so he's still normal. But you can see that more of the neutrophils tend to have 4 or 5 lobes than the 3-ish kind of lobe, which is more traditional for our neutrophils. So even though they're not hypersegmented, the neutrophils still have a lot of segments.
Yeah, there's definitely this is a quantitative process, counting lobes, but there's a qualitative bit to this too that's harder, comes with more experience. But I agree with you 100% that one on top, even though it's in range, it's starting to show. Yeah.
Not sure the middle though. There's a lymph.
Yeah, and this is a great opportunity to kind of show how big these cells are.
Yeah, so just like with, or I guess opposite of IDA, iron deficiency, when we were talking about, you look at that lymphocytic nucleus and this small round resting lymph, like this guy should have a nucleus that's about the size of a normocytic red cell. So you can see that this guy here, this nucleus, is more on par with like this guy here as compared to this guy and this guy and all the really significantly larger macrocytes that are in this field, which there are several. So using that small round resting lymph, if you can find one, because it's typically a ton of neutrophils in a megaloblastic anemia, and you see less lymphs in the peripheral blood smear. If you can find one, it's really helpful, again, if you don't have a ruler in your ocular.
Looks like a couple of dacryocytes too, right? Kind of hanging out.
Yeah, there's a few in here, right? So you got this guy over here, teardrop cell, and it looks like he might be a little polychromatophilic also. Yeah. Again, the polychromasia is our stress retics, and you really don't have erythrocyte production happening at large levels. So you're not going to see the polychromasia until you actively start treating them. And then you'll see some of it starting to come out. So I think that's actually an important thing to distinguish when we talk about macrocytic disorders. The hypersegs are particular for DNA synthesis, which is the B12 and the folate deficiencies. And if you just have a macrocytosis that's associated with liver disease, reticulocytosis, being a newborn, then, it's really, you're not going to see those hypersegs, and it's more associated with, well, it depends on which disorder, but reticulocytosis in newborn is having those retics. So I think it just depends on the cause, what you're going to see. But if you see hypersegs, typically there's a DNA synthesis issue happening.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and some people might erroneously kind of interchange macrocyte or macrocytic anemia with megaloblastic anemia. And it's true that all megaloblastics are macrocytic, but not all macrocytic are megaloblastic.
Yep, absolutely. All right, let's pop over one more, just so we can get one last field. I want to pull this one over because he looks nice and hypersegmented. Right, so just kind of scanning around, we've looked at maybe like 6 fields, and now this is the next hyperseg that we've seen. So as you're doing your 100 cell count diff, you're really going to see several hypersegs. You're going to see enough to call. And I think really, again, in this field, we're just seeing those macroovalocytes. Looks kind of like there's a schistocyte over here.
Yeah, I think there might have been one other one in another field as well. Yeah, and there is, if we look at the literature surrounding megaloblastic anemia, there is a hemolytic component to this.
There is. Yeah. And I think that's another important thing just to mention, that a lot of these anemias have a hemolytic component to them, but because the actual cause of the anemia is not hemolytic in nature, it's not classified as a hemolytic anemia.
Right, right. The hemolytic anemias are typical normochromic normocytic anemias, and it can be confusing for students, I think, but the classifications become clearer the more we dig into the patho.
Yeah, absolutely. All right. Well, outside of those macrocytes and the occasional different morphological finding, the red cell morphology is not quite exciting. It's just macrovallos and then occasional other morphs with hypersegmented neutrophils for your megaloblastic anemias. And I think that's where we'll end here. So thanks for watching.
Yeah, thank you.
Please like, subscribe, and hit the bell if you'd like notifications whenever we post a new video, and feel free to reach out to us on social media or via email with comments or suggestions about future content. Thanks.